All right, I believe we are all set here. I'm ready to go. Hi, everyone. My name is Vivian Topping. I am the Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement at the Equality Federation. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Just to get us started and let folks know, this session we'll be talking about the historic 2020 and 2021 Georgia Senate race. In that race, voter registration, engagement, and turnout was key to shifting the landscape in the Senate with the election of Senators Warnock and Ossoff. There are so many amazing stories of the way communities got engaged and turned out their people, from the youth vote to the AAPI vote, from Black women to rural communities and all the intersections therein. We're here today to bring you the story of how organizing in the queer community, especially the Black queer community, was an integral part of this effort, despite the fact that LGBTQ and pro-equality voters are often overlooked as part of the progressive civic engagement strategy. And we'll talk about how building year-round voter engagement changed the game, as well as how we're approaching organizing after SB 202, Georgia's voter suppression law that passed this spring. As we face legislative attacks on transgender youth, voting rights, reproductive justice, and more, leveraging the power we build in this cycle to continue to mobilize our communities is vital. By engaging LGBTQ people and our supporters in voting, advocacy, and organizing, we have the opportunity to shift the balance of power. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you to our panel for being here. So like I said, my name is Vivian Topping. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and they, them, theirs, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement at the Equality Federation, coming to folks from DC. We're going to do some quick intros here. So it's name, pronoun, organization, where you are today. And Eric, let's start with you. Then we'll go to Malika, then Fran.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Polk. I am the Deputy Director at Georgia Equality, and I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. And my pronouns are he and him.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Malika Redmond. I am the co-founder and CEO of Women Engaged. We are also based in Atlanta, Georgia, and my pronouns are she and her.
Hey folks, Fran Hutchins, she and they. I'm the Executive Director of Equality Federation, and we are an advocacy accelerator for groups like Georgia Equality. We have a nationwide network of LGBTQ statewide equality groups, and I'm coming to you today from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen now because I believe we're going to start with Eric and Malika telling the story of the runoff. So one moment here. Okay. All right, Eric, take it away and let me know when you need me to move slides.
All right. Well, we can move to the next slide. All right. So, I thought a good place for us to start would be with some numbers and with some statistics. So, census data released back in August shows that Georgia has had a dramatic boom in ethnic and racial diversity over the past decade. The trend, as I think we saw during last election cycle, is already starting to have some impact on where the state is, politically. And so, I think this is a very just sort of important piece for us to sort of hold some space for. So previous census data suggested that, the white population here in Georgia would soon become the minority. And so we're quickly moving towards that. And so the most recent census data shows that the white population here in Georgia currently makes up 51.9% of the population. And so that's down from 59.7% in 2010. African Americans share the overall population increase from 31.5% to 33% in the past decade, while the Latinx population went from 8.8% to 10.5%. And the numbers for the Asian American community jumped by more than 200,000 people. So a 54.8, almost 55% increase there. And so the Asian American population here in Georgia now makes up 5.8% of the state population. Then we can move to the next slide. And so we saw this, increased diversity bear out in the election cycle. I think it's also important just to note that, larger populations of folks who are openly identifying as LGBTQ, both in Georgia, but also around the country. And so, this whole thing around diversity, folks, who are coming into the space with from multiple intersections, multiple places of marginalization. And so, just looking at this last year's election cycle, white voters made up 66% of the electorate in 2016, but only 62% in the 2020 general and runoff. The AAPI voters made up 6% of newly registered voters and 3% of newly engaged voters, increasing their voter share from 2% to 3%. For Latinx voters, made up 8% of newly registered voters and 3% of new or newly engaged voters, increasing the voter share from 2% to 3% as well. And then Black voters made up 27% of newly registered voters and 39% of newly engaged voters. Now, the vote share decreased from 30% to 29%, but increased relative to the white vote share. And so, just I think some important numbers around diversity to really think about. And so, Bill, we can move to the next slide. And so, Georgia Equality's approach to last year's election cycle was really to embrace a year-round integrated voter model that brings in and removes barriers for voters from marginalized communities and keeps these communities engaged beyond the election cycle. So it's not just we want your support during the cycle. We want your support around this specific issue area, but the engagement is continuous and year round. And this has been especially critical for Black LGBTQ communities that we all know exist at the intersections of multiple groups that have been historically disenfranchised or marginalized in politics. And so that legacy has included leveraging same-sex marriage and trans rights as wedge issues to turn out socially conservative voters, legislation that traps Black and LGBTQ people in cycles of criminalization and poverty, and systemic efforts towards Black voter suppression, which we will talk a bit more about during this conversation that we're also kind of seeing pop up now. And so we utilize this LGBT supporter model that uses a set of data points to estimate the likelihood that a contact is supportive of LGBTQ plus legal protections. This model has been consistently reliable in identifying pro-equality and LGBTQ plus voters, with a large majority of those folks being Black and other people of color. And this has been successful across several election cycles since 2017. In total, last general election, we completed over 950,000 voter touches to this universe for the 2020 general election. In addition to this very diverse group of pro-equality voters, Georgia Equality also contracted for the general election a group of volunteers, paid outreach workers who really reflect the diversity of the LGBTQ plus community, but also the diversity of the state of Georgia. And so, we had a team of folks working with us year round, 90% Black or people of color, folks who overwhelmingly identified as also being LGBTQ plus. I think about 50% of those folks. And so again, really thinking about making sure the voices of the folks that we say that we want to reach out to and engage with are integral to the work and are leading the conversations that we're having in communities. And so, Fran, we can go to the next slide. And so this is just some top line numbers, just to talk a little bit about the successes from both the general election and for the runoff. And so we had a universe of about 500 voters for the general election and contacted about 370,000. Our turnout rate was about 74% versus the state turnout rate of around 65%. So the actual turnout difference was about 42,000 voters. And we know that the difference between Biden and Trump was about 12,000 voters. So, Fran, we can go to the next slide. And then for the runoff, we contacted about 800,000 voters. We actually made contact with about 562,000, a turnout rate of almost 70% versus a statewide turnout rate of about 58%. And so the actual percentage difference is almost 90,000 voters. And the difference between Ossoff and Purdue was about 54,000. And so 95%, Georgia is showing out. 95% of eligible voters registered to vote here in Georgia. And that's an increase of about 76% from 2016. The 95% figure gives Georgia the 9th highest voter registration rate in America. This news kind of coupled with the census data that I talked about a little bit earlier, about us, really becoming more diverse, means that we now also become, a target for voter suppression and what we're calling Jim Crow 2.0. And so, Fran, we can move to the next slide. And so what we've seen is SB 202. Yeah, I know my partners here will talk more about it. But this past legislative cycle, SB 202 became law. It's a voter suppression law here in the state of Georgia. Among its restrictions, a shorter window for voters to request mail-in ballots, an updated voter ID requirement, bans on distributing food and water within 150 feet of a polling place. The early voting period during the runoff elections has also been shortened. And, there are a number of lawsuits currently challenging the law, but we also are pragmatic and know that that's an uphill battle. I think one of the things, and maybe we can share here a little bit more about the law, is so much has been said about this one piece of it around not being able to pass out food or water, and the law has a lot really suppresses the vote, and creates a real barrier. And so for folks who are tuning in today, I don't want us to get so, that's been the headline from a lot of the news, is this food and water piece. And a lot of people may be like, well, what's the big deal? And that's also sort of, us needing to get in front of some of the messaging, because there are real barriers that have been put in place by enacting this law. And then my last slide, Viv, I want to make sure we have time for some good conversation, is that 17, there have been 17, at least 17, there may be more than that at this point, anti-LGBT bills signed into law, specifically targeting trans communities. 2021 is already the worst year in history when it comes to legislative attacks against trans rights. And this is just a part of voter suppression, a part of the horrible laws that are happening in the reproductive justice space. They're targeting the same folks and same populations of people. And so, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we, build a broader tent, and what some of those strategies look like. But that's just kind of an update of, some of the work that we were able to do during the 2020 election cycle, some of the things that popped up as a result of some really strong efforts. Um, and we're going to talk more about what we can do to make sure that we're able to, um, fight the bad stuff that's cropped up, and continue to have some real successes.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Malika, we're now going to turn to you.
Perfect. Thank you. And really, thank you, Eric, for that context, because the data is so important to think about, to understand the political moment that we're in, and to also understand how substantial the Black youth vote, LGBTQ vote in Georgia really was, and also just the activism and advocacy that took place in 2020, despite everything that was happening, is quite substantial. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus in on what I have here and the audacity to speak about Black queer youth as those who really saved this democracy, and center their stories, because I get the opportunity to work with young people every day at my organization, Women Engaged, here in Georgia. Um, Viv, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So let's just step back for a moment. All of us here who are participating with Netroots, know pretty intimately how difficult 2020 was. And just to highlight, 2020 for the work that we do here in Georgia, that includes reproductive justice advocacy, that includes integrated voter engagement. We remember there was the census last year, and so doing census education and outreach, getting pledges to make sure people get counted, along with, a presidential election year. So, all of the work of getting people registered, but also making sure that, our folks that we work with at Women Engaged feel confident from the point of registering all the way to the polls, feeling confident about what they're going to do up and down the ballot, and feeling confident about that, knowing what they're doing on behalf of the issues that are most important to their lives. For us, that's integrated voter engagement. It is the opportunity to support someone from start all the way through to the polls, feeling as excited as they were when they first registered to vote to when they actually go and vote. And so this was the work in 2020, and we know that it was an uphill battle because there was the many sort of disinformation, the misinformation campaigns that were taking place, discouraging early voting, discouraging people from voting by mail, discouraging and people to get counted through the census. And so it was very important for us at Women Engaged to think creatively on how to use platforms such as social media. Because why? There was also a pandemic and 2020. So for all of us who really get into the nitty gritty with get out the vote campaigns and the like, 2020 was really hard because part of what we love is to be able to be face to face with our neighbors, with our voters, with being able to knock on doors and to talk to people, and especially in communities such as the ones that we work in here in Georgia, primarily working class Black communities, where oftentimes the doors aren't being knocked until 2 or 3 weeks out to an election cycle. People are then bombarding individuals with who you should vote for and not why this individual has your best interest in mind and the issues that are important to you. That becomes secondary. So for Women Engaged, our conversations at the door are really about how are you doing? what are the issues that are important to you, and connecting that back to the importance of the voter engagement. So we didn't have that last year. And for many of us, as you know, Netroots, you didn't have that. So we had to think very creatively on how to get this information out. For our young people, at the same time, for many of them, they were facing, having to transition in the middle of a school year back home. We had a number of young people who had to leave their campuses, go back to their respective state, to live and try to do virtual classes, trying to figure out while they're registered to vote and are residents of Georgia in their current state. There were a number of uphill battles. And then, and so to just sort of think about in sum, what were the things that we were dealing with, and what we were able to do. This kind of gives you, this bar graph gives you an idea of our work in 2020 into 2021, runoff with our universe of voters, and doing primarily work that was virtual, having to move to virtual space to contact voters, to engage them creatively, phone, text, mailers, as well as through social media platforms, doing social organizing work that way. Okay, Viv, you can change it. And so again, just a little bit more data of our work in 2020, 2021. For Women Engaged, we primarily target Black women, queer Black young people, Black folks who are considered working class, Black folks who, who have been considered voters who are inactive, and we want to uptick their voter participation. And so we really try to hone in there and support folks getting out to vote. So you can go to the next one, Viv. So this just gives a little bit of an idea pre-COVID pandemic of some of the kinds of festivals and events that, Women Engaged attends to, engage young queer Black voters, or newly, get folks registered, and to start to talk to folks. And so we have, obviously, in the greater metro Atlanta area, a really, you know, um, it's been sad. Really, with the pandemic, we haven't been able to have all these great festivals. But when we do, Women Engage is out there at them. And so this just gives you an idea. We can go to the next one, Viv. Along with having, a really rich cultural diversity here in Atlanta, we also have an impressive number of historically Black colleges and universities in which both Eric and I are alum of two here in the Atlanta area. And so we make sure that we are also connecting to students and young Black students at the historically Black colleges and universities that make up this greater metro area in Atlanta. And so again, that's just getting a chance to see that work. And for us, our integrated voter engagement work really started in 2014. And it was started because of after the Shelby v. Holder decision that undermined the Voting Rights Act and basically allowed for states, any state, to be able to put in place kind of voter laws without the checks and balance, the pre-clearance to say, wait a minute, would this harm certain populations of people not being able to have access to the vote? And so, the Margaret Cardwell and I, co-founder of Women Engaged, we knew that we needed to get into this game and make sure that we were participating if we wanted to talk about reproductive justice and the other issues that are important to us, that protecting the vote was going to be key to being able to get to the issues that are really important to all of our work. And so this, again, just sort of our work over the years and how we've connected the acts of voter suppression. We saw it very aggressively in 2018. As you know, we had a historic race here in Georgia in 2018, and we saw I believe, what are the effects of what was Shelby v. Holder, and that, as we see, and the backlash, obviously, of what Eric was saying, the increase of diversity in numbers and the populations in these states, and the fact that the folks are engaged politically, and folks are understanding more and more what their rights are and what's important to them, and are taking that to the streets in demonstration, as we saw so importantly in 2020, with so many young Black queer young people out fighting on behalf of their own lives, and then taking that same energy to the polls. Okay, we can go to the next one, Viv. And that's some more highlights there. We could actually, again, more of our data. And you can find information on our data on our website at womenengage.org. We can go to the next one. I really want to focus. Okay, this is really what I want to focus on, because this is what, for me, is what lights me up and makes me really excited and happy, is to talk about the young people who worked with us last year, in a transition from, to a virtual transition during a pandemic, during a moment where we literally saw, a Black man named George Floyd be murdered in slow motion, for all to see, in one of the most degrading, horrible ways, by police. And that the young people that work with Women Engage, took their energy, in the face of a lot of grief, pain, and moved that into demonstrating to the rest of the country what a healthy democracy should look like. And that is that we stand up for our rights, we organize each other and ourselves, we hold public leaders accountable to our needs and to what we desire. We become the leaders, the powerful leaders that we want to see, and what we want to have represent us, and also taking that energy again to the polls and voting, and not just stopping there, not beginning there and not ending there, but also articulating a vision for a world that respects all of our dignity. And so I'm very proud of what happened in 2020 with young Black queer young people here in Georgia, because not only did they demonstrate for their lives, but they also took that energy and articulated a vision and fought back against the misinformation campaigns in very creative ways. We did a whole series of TikTok videos and all kinds of things to counter the misinformation about, how to vote, why voting early is important, but also kept their own public health and safety in mind, wearing masks, providing that out when they were publicly demonstrating, supporting folks being able to participate in this democracy, while at the same time thinking about their own safety and their health. This year, we're doing a lot of work around, again, the misinformation around, how to protect yourself from COVID, having real conversations around the vaccines, and importantly, again, how people can continue to, think through getting vaccinated, staying safe. And so they are making these connections and connecting those dots and doing the work. And what we know in 2020 is that young people, particularly Black young people in Georgia, voted in the election and then continued their momentum all the way through to the runoff, voting at historic rates. And so this is the kind of energy that's just very exciting to think about moving forward. But what we know is that while we're excited about the future of the kinds of leaders that we're developing, that there's also a backlash. And that backlash is severe. And of course, as we know, right after votes were counted and certified in Georgia, there was a major insurrection. And that public backlash that was it not only happened in DC, but happened around the country, including in Georgia. And some of that was, as we know, physical and brutal and public in nature, but it was also in public policy in nature. And so, to the points that Eric made about SB 202, these are the kinds of things that we know that as we stand up and fight for a healthy democracy, there will be those that are wanting to um, maintain supremacy and power that then is at the detriment of everyone and all of us. And we continue our work. And so we're excited about as we move into 2021. Oh yeah, you can go to the last one, Viv. Thank you. As we move into 2021 and into 2022, and we think through our various strategies, we are taking away a lot of the lessons that we've learned over the last couple of years, and looking forward to continuing our work with our partners and others here in Georgia. Thank you.
Well, Malika, Eric, thank you so much for all of that context and all that story. I think like hearing that really helps us really set the stage for what we're going to be doing here. Fran, I want to start a discussion off with you as we're talking about Black and queer power in the South. Tell me a little bit more about like kind of where you're at, what you're thinking about here too.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank Eric and Malika. Every time I hear y'all tell that story, I just get so excited about the project and what we're doing. And when I say the project, I mean, you know, we've got Women Engaged, we've got Georgia Equality, we have a lot of other, you know, smaller grassroots organizations that are really starting to show out and be a part of and be an amazing complement to what we might say are traditional civic engagement efforts. Malika mentioned, you know, going and knocking on doors at the last minute right before an election and you're getting told who to vote for. And, you know, that's the traditional, like old school party-based civic engagement system, which is important and needs to continue. And, you know, this is an amazing new emerging complement to it. And I just want to notice that both Eric and Malika mentioned over and over again integrated voter engagement and becoming an important, trusted partner to folks in the community who have been left out, who have been, you know, not, oh, yay, we have a guest, you know, who have not been paid attention to or engaged in the same way as, you know, good voters or you know, high propensity voters. And so I just think that I just want to reflect that, you know, I've heard this story told a number of times, and I've been, you know, we'll say a little bit earlier about like what our small part in it was, but you know, it's just I can't get used to it. Like the more I hear it, like I'm like, I can't believe that we've been able to build this with this level of investment. You know, it is it's amazing, and I want folks to, I guess, kind of understand that there has been. You know, an increased investment from, you know, maybe not traditional circles, but newer civic engagement funders and you know, smaller grassroots organizations to do this type of work. You know, we might think of Georgia Equality as somebody who has a really big presence in the Capitol and has that amazing reputation, you know, on legislation. But there's more to it, and I just want to recognize how impressive it is and how glad we are that our communities are being paid attention to and being turned out and engaged by these organizations.
Yeah. On that note, Eric, can you speak a bit to the exclusion of Black queer voters from traditional civic engagement strategies?
Yes.
Just, you know, one small, really easy topic here.
Right, right.
You
And Viv, I would also, I think the LGBTQ movement space has to wrangle with, its issues around racism. And I think we also have to wrangle with our issues around the transphobia that exists within LGBTQ movement spaces. And so I think that, these two things have really kept, uh, communities that are multiply marginalized out of spaces, out of civic engagement spaces, um, has created barriers for accessing those spaces, um, and hasn't really been considerate about, what are the best ways to engage these communities. And so, I think that what we're doing now, I think with, utilizing things like the integrated, voter model is about addressing those wrongs, rewriting those, and it has to really be a part of the work that happens in LGBTQ spaces.
Yeah.
And so, it can't be sort of we're parachuting in because, I think about, Proposition 8 in California and just how Black communities were blamed, and so I think there has to be more understanding about, Black queer folks are supportive of, the traditional queer issues, right? But also equally concerned with bread and butter issues that are impacting our lives on a daily basis. And so, um, how do we make sure that we're marrying those two things? Um, how are we careful about making sure we're not
Yeah.
asking Black and other POC queer folks to choose between their Blackness and their queerness, and really understand that these are intersecting spaces, and that we have to approach it in that way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I mean, Eric, I know that with Georgia Equality, a big thrust of your program is trying to engage Black queer communities, right? And so, what are some of the ways that you all have been engaging Black queer folk in ways that might be different than traditional voter engagement?
Yeah, well, one I will say, I think investment and Black leadership within the organization. So I think that's number one. And so I think that, setting the tone from the top, that says that, we are prioritizing Black and POC communities, and we're showing that by how our organization looks and how our board looks. And so that means that how our decisions roll out also are impacted in that. Um, I think another thing is just, really a strong commitment to making sure that the folks who are going out and representing us in these spaces across the state represent the communities that, we're hoping to reach. And so, that's an important part, making sure that we're paying folks like a really good wage to go out and do this work. And that they're able to have, a sustainable living to continue to be engaged in this work. I think so many times, uh, folks are shortchanged, would like to be in this work, but we don't give them an incentive to do that. And so, those have been a few things that we've really made a priority to ensuring that, we're not just here for the minute, but we're here long run, that we're developing the leadership skills of folks so they're able to really carry out this work.
Yeah, and I think seeing the work that y'all have done at Georgia Equality over the last couple of years to really build this has been just amazing. And so, thank you, Eric. So Fran, I know we work at the same organization, and one of our goals is to help groups like Georgia Equality create these year-round voter engagement programs. What, as the executive director and as the leader of this program or leader of this organization, really made you want to focus on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said earlier, I mean, I've looked at Georgia Equality for years as having an amazing presence in the Capitol, having really great relationships, and being a legislative powerhouse, really. And looking at a few years ago, y'all were also a part of the Pro Georgia Table, and starting to get more involved in things like voter registration and voter engagement. And it really looked like there was an opportunity there. Y'all didn't have a huge volunteer program, but it was adequate for what you were doing. But I think we knew, looking at Georgia Equality, and over the course of those years, we started about in 2018, working with a cohort of groups. Georgia Equality, Equality Florida, Equality North Carolina, and Equality Ohio were our first kind of members of that cohort. What would it look like to scale? So we have a few volunteers who are really bought in, but how do we get from a handful of regular folks to 500 folks, which I know y'all had more than 500 people volunteering, Eric, by the runoff. That helps us not only do the work that we've seen all this great data around, turning out these folks, getting folks registered, getting folks educated and engaged, but it also demonstrates the power of our movement, which I think we're continuing to tell that story, and we're going to see increased investment in Black queer communities because of this work. And as Eric just mentioned, it doesn't go away. We're building leaders, we're building community knowledge, we're doing political education in our communities. And so it's not like a campaign that rolls in, pulls out, and then there's just tumbleweeds in the street, right? It's about building that engaged, long-lasting community, and home, like Georgia Equality can be the political home for LGBTQ Georgians. Women Engaged can be that political home for young Black queer folks, right? And so it's about creating that infrastructure and that system in the state that can maintain this engagement, not just when the DCCC or when somebody thinks that this is now a target state, right? So it's really about year-round consistent engagement. So we also don't want to parachute in. And so, for us, it was about providing supports, tools like Eric mentioned, the LGBTQ voter model, which is, just a regular, just a score that you pull out of van. But it really helps create those target universes and start having those conversations with voters we haven't reached before. The states set their own agenda, whatever policies they want to work on or whatever election cycles they want to focus on. But we're there to actually say, hey, let us coach your organizers. Viv was actually a coach for the organizers in that first cycle of this project. Let us help you write a field plan. As an executive director, I do come from organizing, but not all executive directors come from an organizing background, and it can be hard to manage and understand what organizing can do for your organization. And so what we hoped to see, and what I think we did see, especially in Georgia, was the shift in the way that organizing and voter engagement showed up in an organization, like not as a separate program that was kind of siloed off from everything, but that as something that becomes the heart of the organization, something that becomes integrated across your work. So if I'm at Pride, that's a voter engagement event. I'm getting that data, I'm getting that back into my database, I'm calling that person when it's time to, talk about the next, thing. So it's not just about we have this Pride program, and we have our voter program, and we have our HIV education program. It's like, how do we make all of that work together? And I think that in a way we were successful. This is a model that, Women Engaged actually is one of the groups that I got introduced to early on that was already doing integrated voter engagement in Georgia. And so it's not new, but it's just something that I think, as Eric mentioned, LGBTQ folks have been left out of even some of the newer models of civic engagement. And so, we wanted to bring that and support that in the state, and make sure that LGBTQ folks could be part of this movement.
Yeah, thank you, Fran. And just briefly for folks who may be watching the audience, if you have questions, if you have things that you want to bring up or something that's particularly resonating with you, feel free to type in the chat. We can see it. We'll kind of keep track of questions, and we'll give space for questions at the end. So Fran, this year, like you talked about, we really have been focusing on that civic engagement and organizing perspective. And I think it comes at no greater of a time. We have over 390 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced in state legislatures this year. 197 of them focus on transgender people, whether they're transgender children or just in general trying to ostracize transgender folks in public life. What's the relationship between organizing for election work and stopping the flow of this terrible legislation?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. And Malika mentioned too, we've had all of this anti-trans legislation, anti-voting rights legislation, anti-abortion, all of these curriculum bills, whether it's against comprehensive sex ed or against teaching about the racist history of our country. It's all coming from, I mean, this would be a whole nother panel, but it's all coming from the same place. Eric mentioned earlier using these issues as wedge issues to turn out conservative voters. They're panicking and they're trying to figure out how to keep their base engaged after seeing huge successes like Georgia. And so we have to continue to do political education with our communities. Continue to build power, especially in the South, especially in the Midwest, where we're seeing a lot of this legislation. And I think that looking at the January runoff in Georgia, it helped us get a pro-equality majority in the Senate, but we also have to look at the state level, right? The state level is the next opportunity, right? We've got to get pro-equality majorities in these state houses, or we're going to keep seeing these bills. We've got to get pro-voting rights majorities in these, and in these state legislatures, or we're going to keep seeing these bills. And I think that this organizing, this kind of voter engagement, is the key to that. There's been some success stories already in the South. The case that everyone probably in this space is familiar with is Virginia, where they elected and flipped their what are they? Are they an assembly? I can't remember what they're where they flipped their assembly, and they've gotten so much amazing legislation passed since then. They got the first anti-LGBTQ anti-discrimination law in the South passed after lots of organizing. They got a lot of great legislation passed, and they did that because they did that long-term investment in voter engagement in the progressive space. And it was a lot of organizations like this. It was reproductive justice. It was LGBTQ. It was immigrant organizing, and it was worker organizing. And so, I think it's not going to be instant. But building this type of infrastructure is going to bring us to a place where we don't have to see 390 anti-LGBTQ bills filed across the country. And then finally, I think that the other way we see this is too, like the people who we're engaging as voters they might not be just voters, right? They could be, poll workers. They could be people who want to run for office one day. They could be people who want to volunteer and run programs in their communities with our organizations. And so as we, have that first touch with people and we continue to engage them, we're actually creating the circumstances to shift our state legislatures. It's not really just a numbers game. It's about relationships. It's about leadership. It's about engaging the communities.
Yeah. We are running up on about 10 minutes left. And so I want to make sure we have enough time for all three of you to hit this next question. What y'all have talked about has built so much capacity in just the last 2 years, right? Thinking about 2020 and as we kind of come through 2021, there's so much different kind of capacity and work that's been done here. And I think the fear a lot of folks have is like, okay, we had all this energy, like, how are we going to keep it moving? And so I think for each of you, like, how are you working on engaging the folks that you did build capacity with, the folks that you worked with in the Georgia runoff, the folks that you've done in other places? How are you continuing to engage them and continuing to grow those teams? And so, Eric, let's start with you, and we'll do all three. Eric, then Malika, then Fran.
All right. So, I think Fran mentioned, we are able to really build a super robust, group of volunteers during last cycle. In large part, thanks to Viv for a lot of the coaching around that and helping us to build out that program. But it is the consistent communication and engagement with folks on a weekly basis, year round, working on all the things that we do as Georgia Equality. So, Fran, it's like you just said, it's not just about the voting piece, but how all these things are a part of us as an organization, are a part of our goals towards creating justice for our communities. And so that real consistency around engaging folks and really allowing them to see themselves in the work that we do. So I'd say that's sort of number one. Number two is this thought around building out just a leadership pipeline. And so, really developing the skills of folks who are coming in as volunteers to then be able to, go back to their communities and be leaders in the civic engagement space. So even if they decide that they don't want to, be involved with Georgia Equality anymore, that they've developed some really great skills that they can take, you know, if it's just sharing with their family and their community, if it's, helping other organizations think about how they can be more engaged, that we're sort of building, that pipeline among folks as well. Um, COVID, really opened us up to our work virtually and sort of in the digital space, and how we really think about digital organizing as well. And we've actually been able to touch a lot more communities by working digitally and building out stronger digital campaigns that really allow us to actually touch every part of the state and sort of replicate what we're doing, building volunteers, building leaders, and doing that in all of these different places across the state. And so really leaning into that and engaging people in that way uh, is another way for us to kind of keep the momentum going. And then the last piece, we kind of shared about the 95% of the folks who are eligible are registered here in Georgia. And so, what does that mean for us around, some of our work? And so for Georgia Equality, that means that, we're building out a longer GOTV runway, that we are really talking to folks year round about um, going and exercising their right to vote in local elections and statewide elections and federal elections, and the importance of that. So it's not just saying go vote for this person, but helping people to really understand why. Help folks understand what's the difference between a city council person and a state representative. A lot of folks just don't know, and I think it's incumbent upon us to also do that education. And I think now that we've kind of really gotten folks registered, let's do our part to make sure that we are getting them out to vote every opportunity the polls are open, and that they have a really good understanding around who and what these folks do. So
Yeah, definitely. Malika, what about you? One way that y'all are in continuing to engage these folks and continuing to kind of keep this capacity moving forward?
Well, one of the things I would want to acknowledge in this conversation is that, to Fran's point, Women Engage has been using this model of engagement since 2014. And so we've been in this space doing this work for, this is our 7-year anniversary, in fact. But what that is also meant when we talk about the intersection of, race, race, gender, and these other kinds of important intersections, is that also it has meant that as a Black woman-led organization, that our work is historically underfunded. And even though we are innovating at a rate where other organizations are starting to begin, that I think that was the other breakthrough in 2020, was an actual recognition of the work of Black women when it comes to the democracy and getting out the vote. And so for Women Engaged, part of my work is talking about the truth also of the role that Black women have played and that and so many other Black women leaders are talking about. It is also time to recognize our work, and recognize that part of that respect is by making sure that we are getting funded at the rate in which we innovate. And so that is part of it. How we sustain is by making sure that that is happening, so that the things that Eric mentioned about being able to move young Black leaders up a ladder of, in this field, in this kind of work, can really happen in spaces where they're going to be nurtured and be developed in a comprehensive way. And that, so I would say that that's part of it. I think the other, I would add to what Eric is saying about, the landscape in Georgia. So that, yes, we are absolutely, it's about, having some strategies around the get out the vote efforts in a way that supports people being, year round, every year, special elections, whatever's happening in their local community, knowing it and being able to get it down almost like a habit to go and vote each and every opportunity. Every year you have to raise your voice, and and really being able to make sure that people know, like, really what it takes to do that kind of level investment is quite significant and important. Our communities are also transient. So the issue too is that here in Georgia, while we have that kind of rate of folks that are registered, we have to make sure that our folks know that if they've moved, if they've changed their names, if something else has gone on for them, some other kind of change that may impact where their voting location is and other things, that they also make it a habit to check their voting status. You can get purged from the rolls here in Georgia, and there are other kinds of issues here in Georgia. So we want people to be vigilant about their vote, not sort of think about, well, I registered 2 years ago, or I registered last year or something, and haven't checked their voting status to make sure that, they're still on the rolls, and that their poll is exactly where they live, or if there's some other updates. So we're also doing that kind of education and work as well, so that people understand that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We only have time for one question left from audience folks. And so, Eric, I'm going to pitch it to you, and I'm going to ask, we have 3 minutes left in the entire panel. And so we've got like a minute and a half here. So what did your digital campaigns look like? Was it mainly focused on one platform?
No, I mean, I think we utilize as many platforms as possible. And so, it was all the sort of like traditional things, but also, Hustle, our, texting platform. We did a lot of stuff with QR codes and partnering with local restaurants, and, having, QR codes stuffed in bags. We weren't able to go to a lot of festivals, so we did like geo-targeting in areas, and so yeah, we tried and do all of the things.
Yeah. There were a lot of different things that ended up happening there. I think like the discussion that y'all had about putting QR codes for like voter registration in like the different like takeout places, especially early on in the pandemic, was really, really smart and really innovative, because that was something that people were contacting with. That was one way people were getting to. So really quickly, our very last question. So as strategies have been changing during the pandemic, are there ways of organizing that folks on the panel have thought about continuing with, even as we safely shift back to in-person? And Fran, I'm gonna go to you, I think, just to kind of like give the perspective of the work that you're seeing across the country. Like, what are some of the ways that folks are starting to shift safely back to in-person?
I mean, absolutely. I want to acknowledge that Eric said this, that they were able to engage with parts of the state that they really hadn't engaged with before, because they were doing more virtual work. And as we, especially as we think about LGBTQ communities, there may be like a neighborhood in a big city where we can say, okay, we're targeting this. This is where we're going to find LGBTQ people. But no, actually, LGBTQ people are everywhere. And so using these virtual organizing strategies, coupled with using the LGBTQ voter model, is going to be key for continued LGBTQ voter engagement. So things like virtual phone banks. You can get folks from all over the state to come and volunteer. Doing text text parties, but over Zoom. All of this, I think we're going to continue this because it just gives us such a much larger reach.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Fran. Well, we're at time, so thank you to our entire panel. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Malika. Thank you, Fran, for being part of this today. And this is a really important conversation, and I am really grateful for all three of you to be here today. And thank you to our folks in the audience for being here as well.